Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of RIKK, Institute for Gender, Equality and Difference, the UNU-GEST, the United Nations University Gender Equality and Training Program, at the University of Iceland, I would like to welcome you all to the fourth talk of the 2019 Spring Term Lecture Series. This year, the lecture series is exploring the connection between gender health and trauma. The lectures are held in collaboration with the National Museum of Iceland. My name is Magnea Marrinsdóttir, and I'm the Senior Gender Advisor at the Department of Equality at the Prime Minister's Office. Previously, I have been working on advancing women's rights and their status in Afghanistan, worked in Bosníu-Hersegóvínu and Kosovo, and Palestine and Israel with UN Women and NGO, Swedish NGO. It's a very much of a pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker here today. This is Dr. Marcia Henry. She is the Interim Director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security, an Associate Professor in the Department of Gender Study at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research interests focus on critical military and peacekeeping studies, the politics of sexual violence in post-conflict settings, and intersectional feminist theories and methodologies. In today's lecture, titled Reflections on Gender and Transformative Well-being in Post-Conflict Settings, the Political Economy of Sexual Violence in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Liberia, Marcia will reflect on research conducted a few years ago which seeks to investigate the cultural and social contexts of health and social well-being for survivors of conflict-related gender-based violence. In Bosnia and Herzegovina and Liberia, in particular, the study is interested in building a theory of gender norms and structural forms of inequality in order to understand the ongoing barriers to women's engagement with civil society organizations and legal institutions focused on psychosocial and legal support for female victims. It's my pleasure to give you the floor, Dr. Marcia. Welcome. Henry.
Thank you very much for inviting me here for this week of activities and lectures with UNU-GEST students. Thank you very much, Irma, for hosting me, and everybody in the different offices here. Everybody knows, I think, from my social media presence how much I love coming to Iceland and speaking with you all on issues to do with gender, peace, and security. So today's talk, it's interesting because in the discussions beforehand, I saw that the theme was well-being and trauma, and I was thinking about this project that I worked on a couple of years ago, and that in a way has been both kind of conceptually and empirically sort of stalled. And so I'm really kind of I'm sort of reflecting on what some of those challenges were to conducting that research or starting that research, and I'm really seeking your feedback as to whether you think I should just end the project and give up trying to get funding for it, if there's some really sort of theoretical and ethical challenges involved in designing a project like this. I'm interested in people who have experience working in conflict settings and with survivors more generally, and to get your sort of opinions about what kind of directions we should be moving in if we're working in this general field. So just to sort of give you a little bit of context to the sort of even for the first sort of initial problems or the initial sort of conundrums with trying to put together this project. It's sort of like, well, students, you'll know this from your own experience, but lecturers and professors, you'll also know this from students who come to you, and they have this idea for an essay or a project, and it's got probably about 6 projects in it, And this is sort of what I've been struggling with this project. And, people keep sort of telling me, maybe you should let go of that, or maybe you should put that to the side. And I think I've kind of steadfastly refused, because I think I'm trying to hold this together like a kind of, like a jigsaw. So what I wanted to do was take from a social science perspective, from a lay perspective, a non-clinical perspective, I wanted to try and understand what the context of well-being might be for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So I started off with sort of thinking about conversations that I'd had at different conferences, at different workshops with mainly civil society organizations and women working in activism and in other grassroots organizing, about the kinds of, the kinds of challenges they had to get the voices of survivors, or to get the perspectives of survivors recognized. Now, this was really in contrast to a lot of the academic literature on sexual violence, which was really moving towards sort of saying there is this hypervisibility of sexual violence in research and in theorizing, and really we're kind of, this is becoming quite unethical and untenable that we are consistently sort of, graphically focusing on these painful and traumatic stories. So I wanted to try and understand from the perspective of civil society organizations, well, what are their struggles? And many organizations from, say, the DRC, from Democratic Republic of Congo, said, I don't know what you're talking about with this hypervisibility, because nobody is listening to what we are saying. No one's, there's lots of donor money coming through, but basically we're still struggling with our everyday projects, and we don't have enough funds to offer any kind of therapeutic services or to develop long-term programs. So there was this huge kind of gap between what civil society organizations were saying and what academic researchers were saying about the general field of conflict-related gender-based violence. So the main focus of this research project that I began was concerned with trying to have a better understanding of the socio-legal context of health experiences of survivors of conflict-related gender-based violence in Bosnia and in Liberia. And I wanted to look at this in relation to social well-being in post-conflict settings. So the reasons that I initially chose Bosnia and Liberia was partly because I'd had some prior experience doing fieldwork about security and insecurity in Bosnia and in Liberia, so I was somewhat familiar with the post-conflict context, and I wanted to sort of look at conflict situations that had reached a significant sort of post-conflict phase, that they were in a relatively stable condition, and that civil society organizations had a kind of history that they could reflect on and talk about. So again, the study was concerned through a non-clinical focus with the state of social well-being amongst survivors according to a range of organizations and institutions. So you may know this from your own experience of trying to get funding for a project, that this project was also shaped by various funding calls that were asking for health-related research. This project was funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is a huge philanthropic organization in the UK that mostly funds medical-related or health-related research. But they've been trying to kind of expand their reach, and so they've been, they've funded, for example, they funded the work of Joanna Burke, who has been doing a lot of work on the sort of psychiatric experiences of survivors of sexual violence from a historical perspective. They've been looking at we're recently funding anthropological work on neurodiversity and neuroscience in the context of survivors, adolescent survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in Kenya, and so on. So they're trying to kind of do a lot more work on gender, and they're trying to expand their notions of health so that they're as broad as possible. So I wanted to look at the concept of health and social well-being, not again as a clinical concept, but as a sort of a community concept, a social concept. But of course, myself and other colleagues who worked on the project, we didn't really spend a lot of time actually developing it, because as soon as we went into the literature on social well-being or on well-being, we found ourselves kind of going down a million different avenues. There was so much in the medical literature on health and well-being that was very, very clinically based and used very specific kind of indicators. There was a whole avenue on narrative and social well-being, which was really about, sort of whether writing down traumatic experiences, whether sharing traumatic experiences in various forums actually, qualitatively and quantitatively improved individuals' sense of well-being and their mental health capacities more generally. So it was very, very difficult for us to kind of try and both create a concept of social well-being that was relevant for the post-conflict context and still acknowledge all of the work. But when we started doing some of this field work in Bosnia and Liberia with civil society organizations, we just kept trying to sort of ask people about well-being and social well-being. And again, I've been doing research for so many years. I don't know why I have this very Eurocentric idea that if I bring this academic concept somewhere else, somebody will tell me what it means. And of course, people didn't want to engage with that concept at all. In fact, all they talked about was the political economy of inequality in both of those places, right? They did not frame it as such, but they were constantly talking about structural inequalities more generally. So we were in a way kind of distracted from thinking about well-being in a more meaningful way and developing the concept. So again, we were not well placed to develop this further without extensive research and training. And I think we also felt that we really either needed to bring on a real sort of counseling or psychologist expert to our team, and because this was preliminary research, we didn't quite develop that. So we started off with this very general sense of social well-being, a very general definition, which we developed from a peace institution rather than from the medical field. So this is one of the definitions that helped guide us in our research. Social well-being is an end state in which basic human needs are met and people are able to coexist peacefully in communities with opportunities for advancement. This end state is characterized by equal access to and delivery of basic needs and services, for example, water, food, shelter, and health services, the provision of primary and secondary education, the return of resettlement of those displaced by violent conflict, and the restoration of social fabric and community life. Again, I think this definition fit well with our post-conflict context and some of the work that we'd been doing in peace studies more generally. But as I said, there was a significant amount of work developing the concept of social well-being, and we found that during our fieldwork, organizations continually narrated a very different conceptual framework. They narrated the structural obstacles they faced in providing for survivors. And we knew we needed to develop a concept of social well-being that was based on not only individual experience and agency, but on social context and structure. So some of our original study objectives for this Wellcome Trust seed grant. What we wanted to do was not to actually talk with survivors, because in our initial reviews, we found so much literature around survivors. There were so many studies of sexual violence that involved primary research with survivors in different conflict zones. So we wanted to form a kind of a base of qualitative data on the state of provision of psychosocial support, the challenges facing beneficiaries and end users of those social services and justice programs. And we wanted to compile expert recommendations from service providers, help to facilitate civil society organizations and legal organizations to develop recommendations in order to limit the obstacles that women survivors face. Again, all of this is like, the kind of stuff you put into research bids, and then when you actually get the money for it, you're like, how are we going to do this? This was really ambitious, or we don't know how this is going to work out in terms of what we find. We wanted to also enable this small research team that we have to develop a much larger collaborative grant application and to develop a very specific type of methodology, one that had a very ethical and sensitive sort of concept of social well-being. We wanted to develop, a clear research design with case countries beyond Bosnia and Liberia, and as well as confirm the suitability of potential collaborators. So the idea was not to speak with survivors right away, to see that as part of a further study. But then actually what happened was that when we started to talk to organizations, they literally started to move us in all these different directions. And those of you who've worked in civil society organizations or with civil society organizations will realize that some of the most powerful gatekeepers to actually survivors are often these organizations. They're doing amazing work, but they do have a lot of power in these contexts. So the other thing that we wanted to do was try to qualitatively estimate or predict the potential impact of this exploratory and subsequent research in terms of, drawing on interdisciplinarity and having some global policy relevance. So we wanted to, make sure that it wasn't just health practitioners or just academic researchers who were able to use the findings of some of this research. So some of our research questions were, again, about, what is the overall qualitative experience for women survivors in terms of support, justice, and therefore we equated their social well-being according to these organizations. What are the barriers they face in obtaining support and or redress, again, according to these organizations? So again, and what is the link between this idea of social well-being and sustainable peace as we saw in these post-conflict contexts? So since the research was exploratory, we were guided by the expertise of many of these women's organizations. And they emphasized over and over the political economy and the socioeconomic context of providing services for survivors. So, many of the organizations told us that they had not even established a very basic level of provision for survivors. So, in fact, in Bosnia, many organizations had never successfully been able to obtain psychosocial support services for survivors. So they actually had a civil society organization that was aimed at helping survivors. That was their primary focus. And in 23 plus years, they had never been able to obtain services for the survivors, and survivors themselves had not been able through any other organizations to obtain these. So you have this, this group of survivors who has been going through various types of programs, but has, and has asked for a certain type of therapeutic service and has never been able to receive it, either in the country or out. These were the kinds of questions we were concerned with, and these were the types of responses that we were getting. So again, as I said, we were not focused on interviewing survivors, and the main reason why we did not want to do this was because we'd already been reading about two main issues in Bosnia, more so than in Liberia, but I think it's relevant for some of these older post-conflict contexts, which is the first was extreme research fatigue amongst both the organizations and survivors of conflict-related gender-based violence. and this over-research condition, so that there was actually countless reports, policy documents, journal articles, blogs, books. I mean, there's so many. It's actually quite difficult to kind of get a sense of the actual scope of research and accountability for all of this research. We were talking about that in our classes. And very recently, in one of my courses, Inger Scalesbeck came and was talking about her very first research on sexual violence and sexual violence survivors. And she was reflecting on the fact that she went into this room and there were about 12 books that maybe talked about sexual violence or maybe talked about gender-based violence, and she basically just started reading these 8 books, and that was kind of the beginning of the project. Now PRIO has, I think, some of the most extensive quantitative and qualitative data on sexual and gender-based violence in many contexts. But just to give you a sense that just in Bosnia and Liberia alone, these organizations had such a wealth of knowledge that wasn't quite documented in the way that you could easily search on Google or Google Scholar, and so there was all this information. And again, organizations just kept telling us over and over again, you are not the first set of researchers. There really has to be some kind of stop to this. So we didn't want to interview survivors for that reason, either to re-traumatize them or exhaust them further. And instead, we wanted to find out since civil society organizations had been doing so much of this work, we wanted to really look at what is the condition and what is the experience of these organizations, both in Liberia and Bosnia. And we mainly consulted fairly well-established women's organizations in Monrovia and in Sarajevo, although we did visit organizations in some other cities, but it was, again, very heavily big city focused. So we started to develop this context and conceptual framing, which was looking more at these structural inequalities and gender norms as the kind of foundation for thinking about barriers for women's engagement with civil society organizations or legal institutions or therapeutic practices. So, for example, organizations working on pursuing legal justice were also similarly emphasizing the dire situation of the economy and of politics. So one of the initial sort of findings, conceptual findings when we started, when we were conducting this research, was that it was clear that the framing of these deeply embedded inequalities in shaping women's experiences of violence and ongoing structural forms of violence and inequality had already been recognized by women's organizations working in both Bosnia and Liberia. They'd already been saying this, they'd already been lobbying towards the government, towards international organizations. They were constantly saying, if you don't treat these structural inequalities and these structural problems in society, these survivors will never be able to access anything, or move forwards. So again, one of the conclusions one of the findings from these initial field visits was that also these organizations demonstrated the complexity of the barriers and the causes of gender-based violence within their communities. So when we talked about conflict, for example, when we asked them about conflict-related gender-based violence as our broadest term, so many of the organizations said we can't even relate to these because in Liberia, for example, survivors didn't actually, for the most part, want to talk about the conflict-related gender-based violence they had experienced. They only wanted to talk about the very recent gender-based violence. So, in fact, we as external researchers felt like we were imposing this kind of thread across their life experiences that they really didn't want to be a part of it. And in fact, they felt that dwelling on the conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence that they experienced was actually a major barrier to them accessing services because, for the most part, state authorities would often say, well, that was so far back, we can't redress those kinds of issues. So they continually used a kind of very contemporary narrative of the forms of violence that they were experiencing. So again, so what we realized was that you couldn't identify a single cause or effect or impact of gender-based violence, conflict-related gender-based violence. In fact, there was no clear delineation or no clear difference between wartime violence and peacetime violence in a lot of contexts. Rather, women's unequal position in Bosnian and Liberian societies, we found, inhibits their attempts to achieve social well-being in the current moment. So the social, economic, and political context produces this form of secondary trauma and ongoing social exclusion. And again, this is what organizations talked about. In both places, there seemed to be a need to further theorize and understand what the role of, again, what we called then, as we were evolving the concept, transformative well-being in post-conflict communities might be. So we concluded that this conceptual framing was suitable for very different political and socioeconomic contexts, such as Bosnia and Liberia, despite the very different nature of gender-based violence in the conflict and post-conflict period. And so our definition of, as we were trying to develop more sophisticated but also more problematic definitions, our definition of transformative well-being was somehow combining a sense of social well-being and something like transformative justice. What would a survivor want to be given to them reparatively in order for them to reach a state of well-being? And then when we tentatively proposed positive engagements with justice institutions and processes and with social support and welfare institutions, we found that, again, none of these conversations could proceed any further because the conditions, the everyday conditions of women's lives were so hampered by basic issues of survival and economic marginalization. So when we were in Liberia, organizations told us over and over again that the experiences of victim survivors during war were compartmentalized and were, in most cases, erased in a lot of their narratives and in their testimonies. And that was because the organizations were very heavily invested in constructing gender-based violence in the contemporary period as an epidemic. So they talked about the very high levels of gender-based violence that had occurred since the peace agreement in Liberia, rather than focus on the extensive nature of conflict-related violence during the Civil War. So again, they talked about sexual and gender-based violence as this epidemic. In Bosnia, this was very different. The focus of gender-based violence in the aftermath of war, leading up to the contemporary period, was often quite separated from conflict-related gender-based violence. So there was this clear kind of demarcation. There wasn't a kind of erasure of the past. In fact, it was very much foundational, but it required organizations to constantly go back to wartime. There was no way they could talk about gender-based violence in the contemporary period without actually talking about what happened during the war. In Liberia, it appeared that the main victims of gender-based violence in the contemporary period, are young women and adolescent girls. And again, this brought up some new challenges for us because we were really talking mostly about adult women in our study, and now the nature of who are the predominant victims and survivors really was starting to broaden quite significantly. So the age ranges that organizations were talking about in Liberia were generally age 11 to 24. So this is a completely different group of individuals. In Bosnia, most of the gender-based violence survivors who organizations were dealing with were considerably older. And they had been accessing or not accessing services for more than 20 years. So again, a very different cohort of survivors, a very different set of experiences. And in Liberia, the role of the state and legal institutions was increasing considerably, but it was still scant in comparison to the role of donors and civil society organizations in supporting those victim survivors. So, I was visiting this organization that provides residential services for adolescent girls, and they have something like 23 beds, and these young women who've been victims of gender-based violence they have to apply, and they're eligible to come and stay for a sort of 18-month period where they continue their studies and they live on site and so on. And so these 23 beds are these coveted beds. And basically, these civil society organizations have been running this, arranging for funding from multiple sources, writing research grants, really under a lot of pressure. And they said that very often the Ministry of Gender, for example, would send the police with 3 young women who had come into the station, and they would just literally arrive on the doorstep of this organization saying, can you, take these young women in? And these civil society organizations were saying, so we're actually turning away survivors because we don't have any beds and we don't have anything. And then the ministry sort of says, well, we've done our part. They sort of literally, the police would leave with these 3 girls, and they would have to, the civil society organizations would have to organize for taxis to actually return these survivors back to the police station. So it was a really untenable situation. And again, this didn't have, of course, the legacy of conflict in those contexts has a huge role to play, but actually they were really talking about these ongoing structural inequalities and the failure of the state. Okay, so maybe just a few more findings, and then perhaps we can have a discussion. So in Liberia, there's this disconnect between survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and civil society. Many of the organizations talk about how women very rarely reveal that they suffered sexual violence in conflict, and they often dismiss it as having survived it. But the role of the state and legal institutions in Bosnia is again fairly substantial and highly visible, although of course plagued by many of the same types of barriers and problems. So plagued by bureaucratic inertia, economic crises, and lack of gender sensitivity. So individuals who had been campaigning for, individual organizations that have been campaigning for so many years to try and get therapeutic services in a neighboring canton were unsuccessful. And some survivors had shared with survivor organizations that they felt that there was a kind of intergenerational trap, that survivors and children of survivors would just get stuck, bound to these civil society organizations, and they couldn't get away from the conflict, and they couldn't get away from the therapeutic industry. They couldn't get anything from the state. They were literally sort of trapped in these forms of inequality. And I guess the final sort of finding that came across very strongly from the organizations was that the role of international organizations and international peace agreements, as students who have been studying the Bosnian context will know in particular, these organizations blamed these peace agreements, these international interventions, for exacerbating this impact, these forms of insecurity and these structural inequalities. So they did not necessarily blame only the state or only the Ministry of Gender in Liberia. They implicated the UN for entrenching these structural inequalities, and so they felt that these barriers were not just homemade. So I guess that what we wanted to do with this project was to move social well-being more towards this political economy framework and try and potentially sort of come up with a different framing. And I think returning to this concept of social well-being, well, I'd love to hear your opinions. I think probably needs, if it wants to have this tight link with the structural analysis, I think, needs to account more for not what people want to do, but the ways in which survivors and survivor organizations are structurally depleted on an ongoing basis. And so maybe asking the question, in what ways are survivors and survivor organizations continually depleted by the persistence of these structural inequalities might be a potential avenue forward. Okay, thanks.